What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Welcome to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall, and today I'm joined by my co-host, Dina Tyler. Welcome, Dina.
Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, so today our guest is Paris Williams. Paris Williams is a PhD in clinical psychology who went through his own experience of extreme states and madness. Paris works as a therapist with people diagnosed with psychosis, including from a spiritual emergence and trauma perspective. So welcome to Madness Radio, Paris Williams.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Dina, for having me.
Yeah, and I understand that you recently deregistered as a clinical psychologist, so I want to congratulate you on that.
Yeah, that's right. There's been many years of cognitive dissonance with that title, I have to say, wanting to make changes from the inside, but struggling with the conflict in my own personal and professional ethics and values. And finally, the dissonance just got too much, and yeah, I let it go, and it's very liberating, I have to say.
So you stepped away from that official licensing position because you just don't agree with the way the system works.
Yeah, there's just been so much about the lack of commitment to, actually the code of ethics really isn't that bad, but the commitment to it, and especially the issue around forced treatment and like not really using genuine informed consent and pressure and coercion and all these kinds of, and power over dynamics and all of that I'm sure you're both very well aware. Treading around that for all these years, just refusing to be part of that, but just such a dance, holding the title I hold, and yeah, so finally I just left, and I'm actually starting another organization called Integrative Psychology Alliance at the moment to try to remedy some of those issues, just with another set of dissident psychologists. A number of them have left as well, so we'll see where it goes.
Fantastic. That's great. You're exactly describing why I was in a licensing program, and then I just said, no, this is not going to work with me. I don't want to be part of this, even though I was in a progressive spiritual claiming, let's say, licensing program. That's also your path as well, Dina. You identify as a counselor and coach. You do therapy with people, but you didn't do the licensing clinical psychologist pathway.
Right. I felt that there was just too many limitations in the way that I wanted to work and the way that I felt would be helpful. Even, somebody that had been through it, I didn't want to work in that way. So I took the other route of just not going for licensing MFT and bringing what I bring as a counselor.
And one of the things that I was taught is that you kind of sit behind this shield or this screen, and the idea that a therapist is going to be talking about their own personal experience was really frowned upon, or if not prohibited, because the idea that it would interfere with treatment and negatively affect the clients. But actually, I think maybe the three of us believe the opposite, that our personal experience going through what people that we work with have gone through actually enhances and strengthens our work. Would you say that's true, Paris?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, of all the fields of psychology, the formal fields, that's why I was drawn more to the humanistic fields, because especially Carl Rogers really laid out, those principles of empathy, genuineness, and positive regard. And genuineness being a really key aspect of that. So I think just bringing your genuine humanity into the relationship, I think is so important.
Well, that's what I was thinking we could kind of dive. There's a lot of things that we can talk about, and I want to remind people, I did do an interview with you, Dina. People want to check out Dina Tyler. I think it's called Communicating with Psychosis. Is that on Madness Radio? Yeah. So definitely check that out. There's a lot of things that we could talk about, but I really want to spend our time today talking about, like, how do you work with people struggling with extreme states and madness? It's a very broad question, and maybe also what is different about the way that we work and the way that kind of a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist or maybe traditional mainstream. And it's a very, very broad question, but I think it's a question a lot of people have. I mean, there even has been a belief in the field that you can't do psychotherapy with someone who's has a certain experience that's too far out there, too extreme. And now that kind of has been revised, that okay, well, yeah, counseling is good, it's supportive, it's good to have some kind of like psychosocial component, but really it's a complement and to medications. The medications are really the bedrock, and then if you kind of want to add these additional, and I think the three of us would really, because I understand, Paris, you don't take medications, is that right?
That's right.
And what was were you diagnosed with the big bad schizophrenia label, or what was your diagnosis?
No, actually, I managed to avoid the system altogether, so I never got a formal diagnosis. Well, now having gone through the whole getting steeped into the DSM model and all of that, it probably would have been like schizoaffective, right? Because I definitely had the big swings of emotion combined with a lot of anomalous experiences.
Oh yeah, that's what they threw
Anomalous.
at me too.
Yeah, so I think somewhere between bipolar, schizophrenia, we'll just call it schizoaffective, something like that.
Something like that. Yeah, you got everything. Let's just.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And Dina, you were diagnosed with psychosis, but they gave you the bipolar.
They gave me bipolar and psychosis NOS, meaning not otherwise specified. Some kind of psychosis. We can't figure it out. We'll just throw the psychosis. And they were tossing around schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, but I decided I didn't want another label at that point, so I stopped telling them things and exited the mental health system.
So Paris, do you want to just maybe tell us a bit about your experience and what you went through, and how did you end up being a psychiatry avoider? How did you kind of not get into the system?
So there was quite extensive trauma in my childhood that I managed to basically bury quite effectively. And interestingly enough, I turned to hang gliding. I had a real passion in flying. It was like, as I was going through all that trauma, I had this really intense longing to fly. I lived rurally and was just fascinated by the hawks circling overhead. And I had myself convinced that I was actually growing wings. Like I was asking my stepbrother, are those little nubs on my back? Are those wings? And I just had this belief that I'd somehow be able to fly out of this hellhole, that I was living in. That never happened. However, I did learn how to hang glide and became an instructor at 18.
So remind us what hang gliding is. Basically, you have a kite with a bar and you jump off a cliff. Is that basically what hang gliding?
That's pretty much it. Yeah, you have a triangle shaped bar and a big kite, and you hang on, you hook into it, and you launch off a mountain or a cliff, and away you go. And you can fly for many, many, many hours and many miles now. So with these newer gliders. But I became an instructor and became really into everything to do with flying, developing, designing hang gliders, doing lots of competition, aerobatics, cross country, the whole thing. And it sort of was able to help me keep everything buried. But I would go through these states where I'd get really depressed. If I didn't fly for like more than a week, I'd start getting majorly depressed, like even suicidally depressed. So it was my drug, basically. Like, even though I was meeting lots of other needs that I think were really great, there's also kind of a drug element. Like I had to basically keep the adrenaline going in order to keep the depression and everything buried.
I think a lot of athletes report that actually they've got to do the running and they've got to get to the gym, and then if they don't, then some depression comes. But you don't think it was like an addiction to this is what people say, there's an addiction to the adrenaline high. You think it was all the horror of what was going on in your childhood and family and trauma that you were really avoiding by using this running away, sports, adrenaline, hang gliding focus.
Yeah, retrospectively, I would say that. I mean, at the time, I kind of believed what I was told from my parents, that I was broken. I was actually diagnosed. I did have a diagnosis at an early age, at age 7.
Here it comes. I knew that. Okay, you didn't completely escape.
I forgot about that. That's true.
I forgot about that.
But actually, at age 7, the family was falling apart, and I was deemed, the identified patient, as the problem child. And I was given an ADHD diagnosis, and you can't diagnose a 7-year-old with a personality disorder, but they basically said I was on the verge of borderline personality disorder.
You were on the border of borderline personality
Yeah, that's
disorder.
right. Bordering borderline.
Bordering borderline. Wow.
Exactly. That's
well,
right. And then I was sent to a corrective foster home for some years, several years,
whoa.
to try to fix me. So I had this belief that I fought it, very very strongly, very passionate against all of that, but I still kind of soaked in that there was something wrong with me.
Here I was thinking that you truly were an evader of psychiatry, but actually no, you got hit by the system pretty early, it sounds like.
Yeah, that's right. It's right. Yeah. So I got hit quite early.
What was going on in the family that was, you described it was really falling apart and it was really traumatic?
I was the only child of my mom and dad, and they broke up when I was 2. It was a very short marriage. My mom was starting to have extreme states herself, actually, and her brother. So and her mother. So there's a lot of extreme states in that whole side of the family, actually. So that's how I already had, in a way, I already had the scarlet letter. Like, I stayed with my dad and moved in with a step family. He married another woman, and she had 3 kids.
These family members had been in the system and gotten diagnosis.
Yeah, her mother, and so my mom, my uncle, and my grandmother, yes, had been in the system. My grandmother committed suicide in an extreme state.
Wow.
My grandfather had been in a hospital. I'm sorry, not grandfather, uncle,
Wow.
in a hospital. And then my mother was a really effective avoider, I have to say. So I learned a lot from her. So even though I wasn't raised with her, she kind of gave me these early warnings, like about the system and all of this kind of stuff. But I was raised with my father and step family from the age of 3. And they because of that side of my family and all the kind of madness over there, I sort of already had this kind of scarlet letter that everyone sort of expected I would be mad too. And I was I was quite a hyper energetic child, and my step family was like the exact opposite. They're very shy, very introverted. So I was youngest, but anyway, I fit right in. I just plugged right into the identified patient role perfectly into that family system. My dad and then stepmom and her kids. And so by the time I was 7, the family wasn't working, and I was definitely the scapegoat there. And it was partly because, I was broken. I come from the madness in my side of the family was the belief. And I did get those diagnoses. And then I got sent to foster home, which was actually very traumatic. That was really intense. It was kind of a combination of being kicked out of the family as well as going to a foster home that was quite abusive. A lot of sexual and physical abuse.
How old were you when they?
I was 7, or actually I was 8. I think I just turned 8. I just turned 8, and I was there until 10. And I was told I would stay there until I was better, basically. And so it was an indefinite assignment to this home.
Remind us how old you are now. So what years was this?
I'm 50. I'm 50 now. 50 years old. So I was 8 to 10. I was only there 2 years. It was quite interesting. It was a very intense fundamental Christian foster home. Extremely disciplinary, and they were almost they're all boys, and they're virtually all orphans. There's a couple like me who had got sent there from a family, but most of them didn't even have a family, and it was definitely disciplinarian. So it was all like troubled kids. We were all considered quite troubled. And I remember at first I thought, oh, this is cool. I'll be able to hang out with a bunch of fellow kids, and this will be fun. It'll be like camp, but quickly, really, there's a lot of abuse and intense. I mean, they worked us to the bone and intense discipline. And by the time I was 10, I still had the story I would be there till I was 18, unless I got better. Whatever better meant, basically better meant not being oppositional and defiant. That was the other diagnosis. That's right, oppositional defiant disorder. Yeah, I had a few. So I'm actually kind of proud of that diagnosis, to be honest with you. But anyway, at age 10, I thought, oh gosh, as much as I really don't want to go back to my other family, it's actually better than this place. So I went ahead and I did everything. Yes, Jesus. Yes, I'll do it. I'll say whatever you want. And I just, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. And I just they were just amazed. Like, oh my God, he found Jesus. He found his heart, and he's all better. And they sent me back, and all I did was learn how to be a good actor. Basically, I just put on a really good act, got out of there. But now I was living under the threat of getting sent back as soon as I acted up again. So then I just withdrew. I became totally reclusive to my family, and actually even from the world in general. I became really I went from an extreme extrovert to extreme introvert for quite a few years there. And then I flew out of that literally on a hang glider, when I was 17. And then, but I buried all that stuff, and the sky helped me to basically keep it down. Again, in the moment, I didn't really know 100% what was going on. I just knew I wanted to fly, wanted to be free, and that represented freedom to me.
Do you think that this high energy that got called ADHD, do you think that you kind of channeled some of that energy into the hang gliding and the flying?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. I mean, in hindsight, it was kind of I was just passionate. Like, I just loved life, and I was super curious, and I loved adventure. It was a shame that it got so pathologized.
Can you just help evoke to us what it's like to hang glide?
I actually just went this last weekend and had a amazing in the central Otago, which is right over the Alps. So the New Zealand has mountains that are very similar to the Swiss Alps, call them the New Zealand Alps, and got up to about 8,500 feet and just flew about 60 miles, but just kind of touring from mountain to mountain, on the Alps, and a few hawks, getting right up to cloud base, so circling thermals right up to cumulus clouds, which are the tops of thermals. It's quite magic, and it's just totally quiet. Right? A little bit of wind. There's no motor. You're just working the currents, so you can't see the thermals. So it's all. I think you feel just like a bird because you feel the thermals through your fingers, and as you're flying, you go, oh, there's some lift, and you turn, and sometimes they're really tight, powerful, little windy. They're basically would look like little tornadoes if you could see them. And so sometimes you got to really hang on, they're like, you hook into it, and on a good day, you can be going up 1,000 feet a minute or even faster. So it's just really intense, really fun. And then, it's really hard to put anything like that into words, but it's as good as I can do. Yeah.
That's incredible. It's such a wonderful antidote to the horrors that you just described, going through being kidnapped and put in that horrible, abusive place. And do you think that if you hadn't had that horror to escape, you would never have found hang gliding, or do you feel like that was just your destiny, and as soon as you found it, you would have just gone for it?
I would have been, well, I was already heading heavily into drug abuse, alcohol abuse at that age already. Like I was drinking really heavily by the time I was kind of 16, smoking lots of weed, eating lots of magic mushrooms, stuff like that. But I think if I hadn't found flying, I think I would have probably gone down the path of probably either jail or psych hospital. I wasn't in a good place at all. So it really pulled me out of there in so many ways.
You found a different way to get high, like literally.
That's right. Literally. That's right.
God, what an incredible story. Wow. I just have this vision of you spiraling up on these thermals and going out to 8,000 feet and 60 miles above these Alp mountains. Just incredible. It's amazing.
Yeah. I was actually got my longest flight was 318 miles. That was a long flight, and been up to even over 19,500 feet. It's the highest I've been over the Rocky Mountains. So it's just incredible what you can do on this tiny little kite. Like I still can't quite get over it. But
19,000 feet up, and you went 315 miles is the farthest you went.
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, it's a real, I mean, I still can't, on the physical dimension, the physical plane, I still can't imagine anything more free. But there's other kinds of freedom, no doubt, that I learned later.
And you're not up there thinking, oh my God, I'm going to fall. Oh my God, I'm going to fall. Oh my God, I'm going to fall. You really just, you get comfortable up there. You just are.
Yeah, mostly. It depends, mostly. But occasionally when you get in some really big air, kind of the equivalent of like, big wave surfing or something, you get really strong thermals. It can be a little scary, because the glider could potentially tumble and break, and it's rare, but it's so sometimes you're having those thoughts, but we actually have a parachute.
So this is a death defying sport you're doing, basically.
Yeah. Especially the way that I ended up doing it. I because it became, again, in hindsight, it was so much about me managing my trauma, my unresolved trauma. I needed that adrenaline fix. It was more than just getting high and the freedom. That was a big part of it always. But this turned into something else. Like that adrenaline rush became so important. I basically had to keep pushing the bar further and further and further towards death. Like it was, that expression that the closer you are to death, the more alive you feel. And I was feeling so dead inside, I'd become so depressed, and I had to keep pushing that bar. So I got into really extreme aerobatics, doing like loops and rolls and spins and really low to the ground, and lower to the ground, just really pushing that edge, and amazingly survived it.
So Paris, explain to us how this is healing trauma, because some people would, because I think that's maybe psychiatry would say, well, this is actually a symptom of trauma. You're actually doing something. This is danger to self. Like, this is dangerous behaviors. Why are you not just reenacting your trauma? How is it that pushing ourselves, encountering death, taking risks, meeting that fear, how can that actually be healing trauma?
That's a great question. I absolutely think that it was my salvation. I really believe that, even though it certainly could have killed me. I definitely pushed it, and I had a few close calls. I think there's this organic, like in some of the methods, the therapeutic methods I use, we use the word organicity, which means this constant drive towards health and wholeness, towards surviving and thriving. I think it's always there, no matter how wounded you are. I was pretty wounded, but there's a part of me that really wanted to live. Like, I wanted to enjoy life. And because of all that trauma I was holding, I felt quite dead. There's a real, part of having significant unresolved trauma is you often go into quite a deadened place. You're just surviving. And so this was a way out of that. It gave me a way to actually thrive, for those moments that I was in the sky. And so I see it as a real healthy tool towards really living. I mean, it ended up becoming a kind of bipolar relationship. It's like going from one extreme, to the other. When I was flying, really happy and excited and alive, and when I was on the ground, I just felt horrible, so definitely developed that quality. But it gave me, I think it did give me a way out, a way through. That eventually opened the door to, I think, a deeper experience of freedom that hang gliding never quite attained. Basically working through that trauma, like genuinely, rather than just kind of avoiding it, because it definitely had an avoided quality. Like, I was avoiding it. I was doing it in a way that was making life worth living. I didn't want to, even though I had suicidality, this gave me like reason to get up in the morning and something to live for and all of that.
It's really interesting, because I think that often the solution or the pathway out of suicidal feelings is risk-taking. Often people need to try something different, maybe blow up your life or do something or make a big change. And that can be scary. That the two things are really closely related, that surviving the desire to die may involve risking actual dangerous things in life, or maybe symbolically or psychologically dangerous things.
In the same vein, I was just curious, since you are you teach people how to hang glide, and is this part of the way that you help them through healing their trauma? Do you go there as part of your teaching?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I became, that was my profession for quite a few years, teaching, and did really well in competition and stuff. And as I was doing that, a big part of that is helping people overcome their fear, of course, right? So many people who came to, like, a lot of times, there were a lot of people like me. They were just like right into it. They didn't really have a huge amount of fear to work through. But then there was lots of people that were terrified, especially people who got the gift certificate from somebody to go do a tandem hang gliding flight. They didn't really want to be there. So I got a lot of practice supporting people and helping them to relax and settle and work through their fear, and just really have that experience of, look, if you're actually able to tame the fear, look at what an amazing experience you can have. And so that did, even though it wasn't formally therapy, it was definitely therapeutic to many people, no doubt.
Yeah, it's making me think of my my adventures with rock climbing, and even going to the rock climbing gym, which is terrifying. You've got pads underneath you, but if you're up 12 feet, 15 feet, and you slip and fall back, it's a scary experience. And you slam the pad, and you can really get bruised, you can get really shaken. And being able to there's a word that gets used in trauma therapy, titrate, like the idea that you bite size, you get a little bit of fear and you get familiar with it, you get a sense of control over it, and then you bite another little bit of fear, rather than just having the fear either flood you in this giant overwhelming, or you just avoid it with this kind of deadening running away strategy. Would you say that that's kind of what you've been doing with your hang gliding?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of interesting because even going back before the hang gliding, I had this weird relationship with fear since I was maybe kind of that really early, 8, 9, 10, where I kept doing things like, scrambling on edges of cliffs and climbing buildings and like railroad bridges. And I had this, yeah, it was like I wanted to overcome my fear. It was like this intense urgency to do that. Like it was kind of fun, but it was more than that. And again, I kind of recognized there was like this deeper fear that I was really trying to master. I was mastering physical fear, but it was actually a deeper existential fear and fear related to being kicked out of my family and all that stuff. Fear of my own, something's wrong with me. So in a way, I was trying to master my fear of all of that in hindsight. But it definitely paved the way to do my own genuine healing process, to work through those deeper layers of fear, starting with the physical and then eventually going these more working through psychological, spiritual, existential fears, you might say.
Fear is a huge thing that I think comes up around extreme altered madness, psychotic states. There's the fear that often underlies what the person is going through, and then there's the fear of the consequences, like I'm going to get thrown in prison, or I'm going to get thrown in the psych hospital, or I'm going to get put on these different meds. But then there's also the fear around the person.
Right. And, there's the fear that can come in from, being traumatized and sometimes that leaving your body, that dissociative state of you're just, it's no longer safe here to be present and in your life and in your body. And, I experienced that very much so personally, where life became very, very, very limited. I wasn't living life and even catatonic at times because I was just not here. And so it's very interesting to see this other way of like really taking that risk with your physical body and having how that catapults you to face the fear head on is really, really interesting to me. I haven't quite done anything like that. It's always been in the like that like little thought bubble of like, oh, what if? But it's incredible to hear your journey, Paris.
But actually hearing that makes me think about you, Dina, because you have spent a lot of time hiding and mute, and yet your public work is so vibrant and so out and so expressive, and you have such a strong voice, and people don't see that you go through a lot of fear even doing this interview. It's like, oh, it's scary, am I going to co-host? So it sounds like all of us have kind of worked with our own fears and overcome our fears overcome some of our fears, let's say, as part of our healing process around extreme states and madness. And I think that's a big part of what we do when we help other people. Would you say that that's true? It's a big part of how you help people that you work with who are maybe experiencing what gets called psychosis?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we go into it, if we look at it from a trauma perspective, let's say, and we basically kind of falling into a kind of fear state, right? And then we get kind of stuck there to some greater or lesser degree. And to be able to actually, come out of that, to emerge from that fear state, it requires a certain kind of, I don't know, courage. I would say even almost a willingness to face death. I was trying to do it literally, but there's something deeper. Obviously, you don't literally have to face death in the way that I was doing, but on some level, you have to be able to face the unknown, right? You have to. It's like your old way of living, of being, is no longer tenable. It's no longer working, and you have to emerge into some really new way of being, and you don't actually know what that's going to be. Like, right? There's a lot of mystery there. And so a willingness to die to the old in order to trust that you'll be reborn into something new, I think ultimately that's how I see the therapy process, is helping people find the resource, the courage, and the faith. I think faith is a big part of it, that actually that will happen. If you face your fears, your demons, so to speak, that, there's every possibility you'll come through the other side and much happier and healthier. So one of the ways I really like working is somatically with the body, because I there's kind of this expression, the body is the unconscious mind. You know, we have the conscious mind, our thoughts, etc. But then our body, the postures, the tensions, the gestures, aspect of the body are actually holding, they're more directly tapped into our unconscious. And so, and it's usually when we're talking about trauma, especially, it's our unconscious. Most of that stuff gets kind of buried and pulled down into the unconscious, right? It's kind of repressed in some way. But I'm working with a client. So I'll give one example. I was working with a client. She had really horrible traumatic event. You know, a man broke into her house, raped her. There's a knife. She was cut badly. It was really bad. And she went into a really dark shell for a long time. By the time I saw her, it was probably, I think it was like maybe almost a year later, and she'd been through a few therapists without making much progress, and was pretty stuck. And it took about a month just to create safety and trust with me, just building some human relationship and connection. And then I just saw, she was in this very curled up state, like kind of like almost like a ball, with the shoulders really in and her heart really protected. But then I could see this part of her hands would start to open and expand, like this little moment of expansiveness, and then it would go back to the ball again. And we had enough trust at this point where I could kind of contact that the body was doing. It's like, oh, I noticed your arms kind of some part of you wants to expand, but then like it's scary or something happens and you go back into the ball. Is that right? And she's like, yeah. I was like, what would it be like to maybe just try really slowly expanding? And she tried it, and it was just too scary. It was just so vulnerable. And so I modeled it. I said, well, I'll tell you what, how about you watch me and you direct me? You tell me how to do what you want to do, but feels too scary. And so I got into the curl position myself, and I started to open, and she would say, stop there. And I'd stop there, and she just observed me. And then okay, go ahead. And I go a little further. And eventually I was fully expanded, arms outstretched, heart kind of wide. And she just observed me in that position. And then I was able to come back to a neutral position. And then she was able to do it. And so that was kind of like using the word titration that you talked about, or bite sizing, but also in this case, modeling. So like I was actually able to model something she wanted to do, and that felt safer at first. But once she actually witnessed it, then she had the courage to do it. And that was this huge turning point in her recovery.
Yeah, and what's remarkable about that is using movement in the moment, which is so missing so much from kind of traditional mainstream analytical thought talking. It's even called talking therapy, or the talking
That's right.
cure. And I think that there's a lot of different approaches that are moving in the kind of direction that you're describing. I mean, it sounds like maybe a somatic experiencing session, or maybe a Hakomi session, or the training that I did in process work. And then also I know Dina does breath work, where there's a big emphasis on, if there are spontaneous movements, you want to see them and support them and allow the person to move through them, because the idea is that there's energy that's held, that's kind of stuck, and but it also wants to unwind. It wants to express, but it's protective, because when it's tried to express in the past, it's been too much, it's been overwhelming, it's been dangerous, there's been an ongoing threat. So how do you make it safe for the person in the present? And I loved what you said right at the beginning, Paris, about this word organicity, the trusting of the really the ecological or the evolutionary perspective that we are living, growing beings that must have an intrinsic instinctual organism striving to heal, that absolutely is true on a psychological level. And so it's not that you're fixing a computer or you're fixing a car by diagnosing. It's interesting, your auto mechanic uses the same word as a psychiatrist does, diagnosing what the problem is, but actually you're with the person, you're creating a safe space, you're witnessing, you're reflecting, you're mirroring, and then you're noticing where the healing is already trying to happen, and then to support it and validate it as a natural emerging. And that means that you can't go into a session saying, okay, I'm going to talk with this client about her fears of opening up in life, and we're going to kind of to discuss her fears, that actually the session takes you in a different direction where she's curled up, and you're allowing that to happen because you're trusting, oh, there's something in this that's actually much wiser than I am. It's like you said, the unconscious, the body is holding the unconscious, and the unconscious has this intrinsic. So if I'm there and I'm patient, I build the trust. If I allow it to happen, oh, here's a contracting fear expression somatically, but there's an expansive, let's explore that. And then you're also, what I think is remarkable about your example is you're relying on the person themselves to develop their awareness of what's happening. You're saying, oh, I noticed this, and let me show it to you. Okay, you're too afraid, it's too scary for you. Okay, but let me model it for you. Tell me what you see, rather than coming up with an interpretation, giving advice, directing the person in a certain pattern or program that you have from your. And I think it's remarkable because I think a number of different therapeutic approaches to trauma are taking this kind of organic perspective. Dean, I know that you and I have talked about this a lot. If there's a family and someone in the family is like, no, I refuse, I won't, can we see that as a positive thing? Can we maybe open to that as being part of that organic healing tendency, that energy and that push and that drive to change and heal, maybe coming out as a way of saying, no, I don't want to cooperate with the system, or I don't want to follow my parents' agenda. And in the example that you're describing, it happens on a body level, with the unconscious expression of the body that's both curling in, but there's also something happening with the expansion. So I think this is a really crucial thing. I know that Stan Grof, who developed breath work, cornerstone of that work is that there's an inner healer, there's an inner teacher that's always working. There's this innate drive to heal. There's this tremendous wisdom. So in trauma, we sometimes think of trauma as a breaking of the mechanism, but it's not. Trauma is really like at least how I think often it's useful to think of it, is trauma is like a held energy that needs to express, and it keeps trying to express itself in a resolution direction, but it doesn't quite have the support on the outside, it doesn't quite have the right safety or the right context. But the repetition of the memories, the repetition of the flashbacks and the triggers isn't just like a broken machine that's stuck on feeding you this tape, but it's actually a knock at the door that keeps coming, saying, hey, maybe you can heal this. Hey, maybe it's time to heal this. There's all this energy in your system. Hey, maybe this time it can be expressed safely. Hey, maybe this time you can find somewhere safe to tell this story, to vocalize the words that go along with these memories and images that keep intruding on you. So I think that's maybe one of the crucial differences from the disease model that seems to fit with what we've experienced, has helped us as survivors, evaders, avoiders, ex-inmates, or of the psychiatric system.
As I hear you talk, as I hear you speak, and really resonating with everything you're saying, I also think about the idea of parts, right? Like internal family systems, or other Hakomi, other methods, psychosynthesis. Quite a few methods really draw on the principle of parts. That we have different parts inside of us, and they sometimes have a different idea about what to do, right? So you often end up with these kind of internal stalemates. And so every part of me has a good intention. They're all trying to serve the well-being, the survival, of this being here, Paris in this case. But they often have a different idea about how to do that, right? And they get in little arguments and stalemates about that. And so when you have trauma, for example, some parts will sort of step up to the plate and be like, protection, you just have to survive, right? So they get very protective. But it's hard to both be in a strong survival mode and a thriving mode at the same time. So now we kind of, we end up, these protective parts sort of running the show for the most part, and we're basically just surviving, not really thriving so much. And so when I'm working with someone who's coming with significant trauma, that's kind of what I'm seeing is, okay, this person they're not feeling safe enough to really thrive, right? And so much of their energy or parts, whatever term you want to use there, is bound up in just trying to protect themselves. And it's completely understandable. Like, I agree with you. I don't actually like the word post-traumatic stress disorder, because it's not actually a disorder. It's more like an injury, post-traumatic stress injury. The person's been injured some way, I think Peter Levine calls it that, post-traumatic stress injury. And so you end up, this person's been injured in this particular way, and now there's a lot of energy bound up in protection. And if you try to push someone out of that, the protectiveness is just going to get stronger, right? Like, okay, this is definitely not safe now. So the only way to help them, to those protectors, to start to relax, those protective parts, is to help them feel safe. And you do that by just, first of all, bringing your own humanity, by your genuineness, being human, empathizing with the person, not pressuring them in any way, no coercion. The antithesis of mainstream mental health, unfortunately. And it's, if you stay with someone, have that kind of patience and trust that, underneath the protectiveness, there is a part wanting to emerge, or more than a part. It's actually really their essence, right? Their essence is wanting to emerge, wanting to blossom, wanting to thrive. Then that can happen, but only when they feel safe enough to do that. And so you can't force that. It's like trying to grab a little carrot seedling and try to force it out of the ground to grow faster. It's like, no, you just have to give it love and sunshine and water, and and it'll grow as fast as it can.
That was one of the things that I really resonated about Jung's work, which can be very analytical and theoretical, but if you really study the essence of what Jung's approach to the psyche is about, it is about creating a dialogue between these different parts. That if his work with the Red Book is sort of the heart of how he saw therapy and growth, that first of all, he has an idea of the unconscious as fundamentally moving towards healing and providing you something positive. And secondly, that there are these different parts, and they are all in the service of healing, but they may need to be explored and be given a chance to have a conversation and a dialogue. Just as you gave in the example of the person you were working with, you're kind of creating a conversation between the part that wants to come out and expand and the part that feels, oh no, wait a second, this is not safe, I need to be protecting. And then trusting that if you can create a space for that conversation, that dialogue, and it could be a somatic dialogue, it could be a body-oriented dialogue, that the process will then start to unfold naturally. And this word safety is such a tricky word, because it's the core, it's the center, it's really the most crucial thing, because that's really how we form relationships. You start to get close with someone because you feel safe with them, you open up. But it's about the mutuality, because I can't tell you that you're safe. I can't say, oh, hey, we don't have any sharp objects around you. You don't have any shoelaces. You're in a locked ward. No one can get in here. You're under 24/7 camera. You're safe. Nothing bad is, that's not, it's a subjective experience of safe. It's an experience of safety that isn't used against a person in domination, but is actually arises from their authentic experience of safety, which is again the huge antidote, I think, to trauma, is really centering on what your experiencing is and having a sense what your experience is, and having a sense of control and freedom, at least in a small way. So it is, safety in a sense is the heart of what the whole thing is, but it gets so twisted and misused as a mechanism of control in the system.
And I would say safety is very close cousin is empowerment, right? Like if you think of definition of trauma is you experience a threat, right? Lack of, opposite of safety, combined with disempowerment, and like an ability to manage that threat in some way, deal with that threat. And so the only way to be able to feel safe and to be able to come through that is to feel both safe enough at least, and empowered. Like I'm not being pressured or coerced into anything. Like I'm actually able to make my own choices here. And so if we think about, the example you gave there, okay, you're in a locked ward and there's no sharp objects or shoelaces. Okay, yeah, maybe I'm safe, but I'm not empowered. Like, my agency is gone. And so that, I think those two, they really have to go together.
Yeah,
and
it's
I think
not
that's
really safety.
It's not really safety. That's right. It's not genuine safety, because at any time someone could do anything to me and I can't necessarily stop them, right?
Yeah. Although on the other side of it, someone might, if it's their choice to go into that kind of setting and they experience that they have control, maybe they could find some safety and some kind of empowerment in that context.
I have a kind of a short horror story about that, actually. When a really close friend of mine, another pilot, I wasn't around. I was actually in another country. I was really sad I wasn't around to help her, but she had gone through a pretty intense depression, suicidal depression, and she was afraid she was going to take her life. So she had a part of her that wanted to live, but other part of her that didn't. Right, it was feeling very suicidal. And she went to a hospital voluntarily and said, "Look, I just need to be kept safe and monitored, and make sure. I know it'll pass. I've had this before." But please, no drugs, because it just makes me worse. Like, I know that. Just watch me. And what do? The first thing they did, they forced medicated her.
Yeah.
And they didn't watch her. And she went into the courtyard and she climbed up a tree and she jumped out and she killed herself.
Oh my God.
It's just horrible. Like, okay, talk about total failure. Yes, I was, devastated. But it was just highlights, the brokenness of the system, right? In so many ways.
So many stories.
Because it's not hard. It wouldn't have been hard to actually just provide this woman a basic refuge. She wasn't asking for much, but so, yeah.
And just to keep the promise, like she went in saying, "Hey, this is what I need." Just keep your promise to her. Don't force her on drugs. And unfortunately, a lot of people have a concept, and they're sold that concept on the websites, in the media, that the hospital is a place of safe refuge, and it's instinctual. You need a place of safe refuge. We're told then that that's the place to go, but then the huge betrayal. I mean, there's so many ways in which standard psychiatric practice traumatizes people, both explicitly in huge ways and subtle ways. It flies completely in the face of what we know actually heals people: empowerment, a sense of control and safety, regaining a sense of agency in your life, and also a connection, not being isolated, not being alone with your experience.
The thing that since we all have experienced these traumatizing settings that are set up to supposedly help, and then have that reverse effect of really hurting us, and so much that we then dedicate the rest of our lives to trying to change or to trying to offer help in another way. But I'm just curious how you also use your story and opening yourself up and with that vulnerability to access a person, to help connect further with a person.
I come from a kind of humanistic frame of genuineness, so I'm not afraid of, we'll do some cautious disclosure, but I don't want to make the session really about me.
Right.
But there comes first of all, there's just the shared humanity. Like, I think, doing my best to kind of put myself in this person's shoes, and having been through some similar experiences as a lot of my clients, is I'm acknowledging I can't know exactly what their world and experience is like, but at least I can kind of get a sense of it. And I can empathize, and sympathize and hold compassion for them. So creating that container, I think we sense that, right? If someone's genuinely being empathetic and compassionate, we feel that. It's hard. I think sometimes therapists might fake that or whatnot, but I think you can sense it. And especially those who have been betrayed, we have really strong radars for picking up on, anything that's not authentic. So there's that, I think, holding that container of just having had that lived experience myself. And then occasionally, we'll disclose, especially when it helps to normalize. Like, I think so much, this is another sad bit of the work here is, not only do we live in a bit of a mad world where there is a lot of, trauma and confusion and spiritual suppression and all that goes on in the contemporary world. But then there's also the additional trauma that's from mainstream mental health fields. So people come into the field typically with some kinds of traumatic events in their life histories, and now they get more trauma on top of it. And not only that, but they also get told really horrible stories about themselves. You're broken. This is just you're just fundamentally flawed or broken in some way. You're going to be like this the rest of your life. You have to stay on your meds. Da da da. And so people come to me not only with the earlier layers of whatever trauma they're originally holding, but now they've got these horrible core beliefs that have been like instilled, into them, which just make the whole situation so much worse. So now, not only are they have fear towards the external world, they have fear towards the internal world too. So it's like fear in every direction, right? It's just an awful place. So a lot of my work has, I kind of use my credentials. Like I suppose one of the things it's good for, because people look up to me, oh, you're, an authority figure. You have these sort of formal qualifications that are sort of approved by mainstream society. And so they tend to listen to me a little bit better when I really challenge the whole DSM, diagnostic system, and I provide another alternative. Like, I'm cautious. Some people are very attached to their particular diagnoses, so I don't just, I don't challenge it really hard, but I just invite them to consider another possibility. And maybe it's possible, I'm hearing the story of a person who went through all these experiences, and it's possible I'm hearing you develop some pretty creative strategies for managing that. You withdrew or you turned to drugs or whatever it is you did, but it makes a lot of sense to me. So I really normalize what they did. And we look at the wisdom of whatever strategies they chose to try to manage what they're holding. And so shift everything from a broken pathological perspective to a wisdom perspective. You're just doing the best you can with what you were given in life and your own limited resources. And it's very rare that someone does, at first it can be challenging for someone to make that shift, especially it's already been instilled quite deeply. But generally, I think I found if you approach it in this way, it's because I think it's true. Like, I really believe it when I'm saying, I think it shifts. People will shift and they start to look differently at themselves. The shame dissipates, the fear of themselves starts to dissipate. And then there's a sense of possibility that opens up, like, oh, right, actually, there's some real gift here. There's some resiliences that I have, some strengths I have. And then that can eventually become the catalyst towards, their own healing and growth.
Yeah, and I think the key to that is like you said, the genuineness. You've got to really see it, and you've got to really believe it, and you've got to really be connected with the person. You can't just be following the script from a Carl Rogers textbook from the school you went to, just to sort of, this is what unconditional positive regard looks like. You have to actually really feel that and create that with the person. And having been through it yourself and knowing that that's what nourishes you, allows you to be honest when you bring that, because you're not overwhelmed by fear. You're not, oh gosh, what if this person really is broken? Oh gosh, what if this person is just not? No, you've gone through some of those fears in yourself, and so the other person can feel that you've actually overcome something, and then that strengthens the connection that you have, and it provides a basis for them to start listening to us maybe in a different way than someone who's just trained in a traditional kind of way, who's coming at from an outsider, separate, distant perspective. They would have a harder time listening to. So I want to, and also, Paris, a big part of your work is spiritual emergence, because we're still talking in the framework of, okay, there's an injury that happened, there is a healing process that's natural that goes on, that engages with the injury, and we want to support the healing, and we want to support the healing process. But where does the spiritual emergence piece come in? Because I know that there's this very mysterious relationship between trauma and initiation, or trauma and maybe we could call it destiny or fate, or you have a certain kind of, this is why I was asking you about the hang gliding and the ADHD, and maybe you were kind of guided to your path through hang gliding from some of these traumas and from some of these fears. Is there a way in which, and it's a very tricky thing, because I would never tell somebody, oh, your trauma is actually a gift, but is there a way in which all of this sort of relates in a larger spiritual frame of initiation? We could also talk about the initiation to be a healer or be a shaman or be someone who's connected with spirit and able to offer it to the community and other people. And I know, Dina, you've thought about this quite a lot. This is a big part of your process and the people that you work with as well.
Right. And just that mindset that, there was deep meaning, and ultimately led to the purpose through all that I had been through, all that, people that I work with have been through. That does it shifts your path, shifts your perspective, shifts who you are, maybe as a human being to become more connected, more empathetic, more understanding of, you know, the connection to spirit and to the deep humanity of suffering with all humans.
Yeah, Leonard Cohen, I can't remember the exact words, but he says the cracks are where the light comes through, basically, right? I think there's a couple layers here. One, you know, I believe that contemporary society itself is quite mad, right? It's quite dysfunctional in so many ways. And particularly, I also come from a very ecological perspective, where I think so much of our dysfunction comes from disconnection to the natural world. I mean, as you know, my essential self is, you know, a natural manifestation of this earth, right? And my cousin, you know, feeling that sense of kinship with the fellow earthlings and the earth, and so much of contemporary society is really, you know, taken us far away from that connection. And I think that alone has created a huge amount of dysfunction and distress on so many levels. So if you grow up in a relatively, I don't know, so-called functional family, and you get indoctrinated into the status quo of contemporary society, and, you know, you don't have a lot of significant trauma, I don't think, in many ways, I mean, that's great that they have that life, but in many ways, you don't have that, incentive is the wrong word, but you don't have that push outside of the status quo. You can kind of end up in a kind of almost cookie cutter contemporary life. And, but if you've gotten really battered, you know, you've gotten really knocked, and you lose your faith, you know, and your family and you know, the values of contemporary society, and you know, essentially experience significant trauma, a couple of things are going to happen. One, you know, you're going to kind of feel groundless, like, oh gosh, who am I, and what, you know, what are my values, and what do I believe in? And you'll be more likely to start to question things, question everything. And so that right there is one push in the direction of, I think, a possibility, certainly not a guarantee, of having a different experience, of actually turning towards something else. So me, with everything I was going through, I turned to the natural world. I was quite fortunate, and I live in this beautiful part of kind of the Northern California Sierra Mountains, and there's a lot of wildlife and open space. And I just spent a lot of time just wandering around out there, you know, in the sagebrush and the junipers with the badgers and the porcupines and the coyotes and the hawks, and that became a real spiritual experience for me. I turned to that because I didn't really have I didn't have any other support. And so in a way, that already started to connect me to a more spiritual connection to the world. And I think, you know, so that's one aspect of where trauma can potentially turn you. And I know many people have a similar story. So that's one, I think, connection between trauma and the possibility of a kind of spiritual emergence, emerging from the spiritual stifling nature, you know, of contemporary society, you might say. And then there's the other piece where, especially I think early trauma, if you've had significant trauma early, your whole sense of self is a little bit unstable. You know, you don't get a really solid sort of sense of self right from the early days. Then there's naturally this kind of instability that develops, and, you know, the sense of, you know, the deep existential kind of foundation that a lot of people take for granted, that security is a bit wobbly. And so then, you know, a certain knock in life, maybe an experience of some mind-altering drug or some trauma or something like that, can really rip the carpet out from under your feet, right? And suddenly it's like your whole sense of self gets, you know, kind of can really feel like it disintegrates. And it blasts you into a kind of spiritual experience, so to speak. You know, you're essentially, it's like, wow, this existential core, existential dilemmas, you might say, if, you know, who am I, and, you know, what's security, and what is God, and what is life, can really show up. So in a way, that early trauma can open the doorway. And that's typically what we end up calling psychosis or extreme states, right? When that happens in a fairly severe form, then you say, okay, a person has entered into a kind of psychotic process or madness process. And then there's that whole struggle with trying to reclaim some kind of deep fundamental sense of security, and how that can be really, you know, florid psychosis. Often, you know, you can see the person sort of grasping at this belief system and that system, and, you know, they're trying to find some ground to hold on to. But as they're grasping, they're also kind of swimming, you might say. What's that expression? The mad person is swimming in the same ocean in which the mystic is swimming. You know, they're in that real fundamental, deep spiritual existential territory, you might want to say. And so that's the other way, I think.
The mad person is drowning in that same ocean.
Yeah, in the same ocean in which the mystic is swimming with the light, I think, is how the whole saying goes. The bad person is not probably experiencing much delight. I know when I was there, I was experiencing a huge amount of terror mostly. So The few moments of euphoria were great, but it was mostly terror. So that, like, if I look at my story and having had that kind of real profound spiritual experience, in many ways, it was the earlier traumas that I had that kind of paved the door. It's not like I would wish that on anybody, but in a way, it set the stage to make that kind of experience more likely to happen. And I think you find that with, if you look at the research on psychosis, right, there's a very, very, very high correlation of especially earlier childhood trauma and, eventual onset of psychosis. It's something like if you look at the average childhood experience survey, something like if someone's had 5 different kinds of adverse childhood experiences, they're 192 times more likely to develop psychosis than the average person. And then once you're in there, you're drowning in the same state in which the mystic is swimming, so to speak. That can open the door to a profound spiritual kind of transformation, spiritual emergency, hopefully coming into a new emergence into a more healthy, wholesome way to be. But a person can also get lost there indefinitely, right? They can get really stuck in that state. And I think that's where the other way that our system really, goes so wrong. One, it adds more trauma into the mix. But 2, it tries to hold you back, right? So here's someone going into the way I see it is the sort of deepest part of my essence in this case is actually trying to die and be reborn. It's like, okay, that's not working. That old way of working, let's, break it down back to the roots and let's come through into something different. And if that can be supported properly, think of the cocoon. If we can create a loving cocoon around this person for the metamorphosis, to go from caterpillar to butterfly, it's incredible what could happen. But if you refuse to if you just hold that person back with really heavy drugs and lots of really scary beliefs about brain disease and all of this stuff, the person can end up just stuck in that kind of partially metamorphosed state of the caterpillar that is dissolved into that goo, and they don't get any further, And we call that florid psychosis.
The shift, and I just was like, we call what we're doing like teaching people to swim, and just swim classes,
Right.
It's but that shift that we are bringing in our work with people to provide that space for them to have this transformation. Those moments when you are shifting someone that has been really just inundated with the messaging, and can you just describe any experiences that you have had with like shifting somebody out of that to holding a broader perspective of what their possibility is?
Yeah, there's a couple layers, as I know both of you are aware of. There's also the issue, which we'll leave aside, but there's substance dependency, right? They've probably been on several medications, and there's a dependency, and that has to be tended to as well. Keep that aside, but that's also something that has to be kind of education around that. Like I'm providing an alternative narrative where I don't believe that you have biochemical imbalance and that you have to have these meds to correct it. However, there is a dependency here that does need to be, worked with carefully and skillfully and all of that. And then, so leaving that aside, it's really just coming back to, I guess I'm holding the faith and I'm holding the sense of like delight in this. I was like, who is this amazing being in front of me? And look, and they've survived all this stuff. That's incredible. And what are the gifts that have gotten them through that? And ultimately, what's the gift they have for this troubled world? And so the way I'm actually holding that. And so our conversation and the empathy naturally starts kind of going that direction. So early on, I start, I get curious about what are the things you actually enjoy or like, or what have you been drawn to, or what do you found yourself passionate about? Or even if you're so distressed, you can't even think about that right now. What have you at some point in your life found yourself pulled towards, or what do you imagine you might, your aspirations? Start try to blow on the embers of their soul, their passion. There's that expression, where does your soul's passion meet the world's needs? So it's like, in a way, we're having a conversation about that. So what is your passion? If we could really like light your soul up and it could just go anywhere, what would that be? What do you imagine that would look like? And then I believe that it would naturally head into what the world needs. I'm holding that as well. And it's people, again, because I have such strong faith in that, and because I think it's true, it works. People start, they feel it. Like can feel it in themselves, like, oh, somebody's actually holding me with like this loving presence, and they seem to believe in me. And, I don't really believe in myself yet, but at least somebody else does. And that, it's often the first stepping stone to them actually believing in themselves and starting to realize, oh, I can have a nourishing connection with my own aliveness. And that's actually not so scary. I'm not just going to find like horrible demons in there. There's actually a lot of goodness in there too. So making sure to spend plenty of time on the goodness, not just the trauma.
Yeah, it can take a while for someone to really get that, oh, this isn't like the psychiatrists I've interacted with. This isn't like the case managers and therapists. This is someone who's coming to me with a very different view. And even when I encounter someone who is, I'll say, well, what brings you here? Let's talk about what it is that you would want to get out of our meeting. And even somebody who has this reflexive automatic use of clinical language. Well, I have bipolar, I have psychosis, my symptoms start acting up, I have an episode and I go into the hospital. Can you help me with that? Well, part of me is saying, I've learned nothing about you. All I've heard is just a repetition of something that someone has told you about yourself. And I find that actually, if I can be curious about, oh, okay, so this person is presenting something that's not giving me information, really, I often will say, well, what kind of episode? Or tell me the story of the episode. And that's the piece that's so missing from the clinical encounter. There's such a rush, which I understand. If I go to the ER and my arm is broken, I don't want them to mess around with, well, exactly what were you doing when you were climbing the tree? And, well, tell me, how did you feel about the tree? Or why were you even with this tree to begin with? Or have you often been a climber of trees? No, I want them to just very quickly assess the brokenness of the arm and very quickly get to what's going to help me not be in pain and start to heal. But the absolute opposite mindset is needed when you're dealing with this fundamentally different realm of human healing and psychology and experience and the heart and building a trusting relationship. If I'm getting my arm fixed, I don't really need a trusting relationship. In fact, just hit me with some tranquilizers and knock me out, and then just send me into the operating room and do whatever you want to with my arm, because I can't fix it myself and you guys are the experts. And okay, let's just go. But if I need to develop a trusting relationship with them as part of the actual healing process, then the actual opposite kind of framing is, you need to step back from the urgency. You need to be curious, because I can also very easily impose a lot of my own assumptions, like, oh, I'm assuming that you're going to find meaning out of your trauma. Well, actually, maybe they may not find meaning. Who am I to say that everyone should find meaning out of their trauma? Who am I to say? I mean, I work with people who are of many different religious faiths. And it's been very interesting for me to sort of notice, like, oh, someone identifies themselves as this, and I have all these expectations. And actually, that's not what, oh, someone says they're this, I'm not going to be able to relate to them. Wow, I really can relate to them. It's just like putting it through a translator. If I just translate some of the words, we're on the same wavelength. But even someone who doesn't have any kind of spiritual views, very strongly atheist, or very strongly identifies of like, oh, that injured me, or I got really harmed by religion, I'm not interested in that. How can I bring the same kind of deep feeling attitude, even if I have to set aside a lot of my intellectual, analytical, therapeutic frameworks? I think listening to you, Paris, and talking with you, Dina, what I'm really getting is that there's something, and it's in this word organic, it's in this word empowerment. There's something on it, almost like an energetic level, that is before words, it's before ideology, it's before methodology. You can't really capture it in language. You can't really market it as a technique or but it's almost like I want to say spirit or energy or something, but I want to kind of just summarize it as like love, that we're really putting love into action. And for me, that means no matter who we meet, no matter what framework that they have, that I'm still meeting another human being. And the idea of a humanistic, I love this idea of humanism, and that just like it's really is an encounter between two people on a deep, deep existential level, and then trusting and having faith that that essence of the work is what's going to be healing to the person, even if I'm totally in an unknown, and everything I've tried, everything I know, and everything I think I know about techniques and approaches and methods and tools doesn't seem that there's something about the human connection that is ultimately redemptive and ultimately healing.
One of the myths or stories, myths that I like to use, I'm sure you're both aware of, is the myth of Icarus. So I often use this with my clients.
Well, very well familiar with that in the myth of Icarus. Yeah. I'm not sure how great it was to name an organization, because Icarus does fall into the ocean and drown, but
that's right.
But then there's a transformation that happened, and Icarus did have a transformation into a new organizational form. So yeah, I'm very familiar with I'm very familiar with. We used to sometimes joke about, like, well, what okay, so Icarus, the Icarus myth has this terrible ending. How can we write a new ending? And some of us are saying, well, actually, Icarus goes too close to the sun, and the wax melts, and Icarus can't fly anymore, and falls down into the ocean and starts to drown. But then something magical happens, because Icarus is transformed into a mermaid. And then there's this mermaid that has the next phase of the story. So but anyway, but yeah, I'm familiar with the myth of Icarus. Yeah.
So I think if you back off from the ending and just the counsel from, was it the father, right?
The lesson. Yeah.
The lesson to his son was, don't fly too high, you're close to the sun, or your wings will melt, or too close to the water, they'll get wet. And so just supporting, in a way, supporting people with that self-connection, like, where am I right now, with my general state? Am I getting a bit close to the sun? Am I starting to, lose touch with the sense of ground and kind of flying away here, floating away?
Or am I getting too close to the water? Am I too in the mundane? Am I too down in the dumps? Am I too suppressing my excitement? Am I too avoiding risks? There's danger in both directions. We often just think about going too high.
That's right. And considering the reef. So if I'm too close to the sun, I've lost my earth, what are some grounding practices I can do? So what can I do that can help me really feel earth and connected to the earth? And, obviously I can look different ways for different people, but, just even connecting literally to earth can be very helpful. Connecting to body, right? Sensations, and can be very grounding for us. And then if you're right, if we're too down, or getting too close to the water, or feeling really contracted, and, often it might even feel like a bit of hopelessness or despair or something like that. It's kind of contraction happens. What can I do to lift me up? What are some practices and resources I can turn to lift me up? So having that conversation with people, so they actually have a bit of a spectrum of resources that they can turn to that kind of go onto that map. I mean, you can kind of get into polyvagal theory and, the different, and the nervous system, and you can have the same map, but it's another way. It just depends on the person and what they prefer, how they prefer to talk about it. But I think that's a really helpful way for working with people with extreme states to build that self-connection, develop that arsenal of resources that they can use to kind of navigate that between too high and too low, so to speak. So that's another thing that I bring into my work a lot.
Yeah, it's extraordinary how studying these myths and folk tales and dreams deeply can have so much wisdom, because I'm also thinking about the myth, the father. It's crucial that the father does warn Icarus, and then he disregards the father. So then you could say, well, actually, you need to be in dialogue. You're the part of you that wants to soar and wants to embrace the wildness and the freedom. Yes, say yes to that part, but also don't forget about the other part, the part of caution and the part of caretaking and the part of wisdom and tradition, and create a relationship between those parts. Again, it's a story of a dialogue that maybe didn't happen, that needed to happen.
Yeah, that dance between earth and sky, right? We don't want to neglect either one. We need to honor and listen to both.
And not doing it on our own, not just crashing ahead. Sometimes we need to, but also, or the idea that there's an inner healer, that there's an inner wise figure. Of course, it's Greek mythology, so it's patriarchal and et cetera, but there's an inner wise voice of caution and protection that needs to also be balanced in the whole decision making and pathway.
Well, I was just thinking how it is. Yeah, it's not about just flying in the middle. We know, like, from your story, Paris, that having that risk and having that, like, ability to push yourself to face some of the fears. And so when I'm working with people, it's about creating your sustainability. So there are some, some of the energy, the creative force that is flowing through somebody, and you just don't push it over the edge. You know how you start to learn about yourself and how you can pull yourself back before it goes over the edge, and you're no longer then able to pull yourself back. So it's not about just remaining completely in the middle, but bringing that into who you are, and at your understanding that you are then sustainable in your ability to have your high and your low.
Yeah, I like that idea that it's not just in the middle. I mean, life would be quite boring if we never took risks and our mood was always sort of, which is kind of the psychiatric disease model. You want to be completely symptom free, and then any kind of difficult emotional state is seen as a symptom. So now you're expected to just not really have strong emotions at all, and then you're just sort of flatlined in a numbed, tranquilizing state. And it's important to remember that the word balance, like balance being about nature, that nature is in balance. Well, nature is in balance, but nature is a dynamism of swings and different energies going in all kinds of different directions. It always has a balancing side to it. It always has a balancing tendency. It comes back, but it isn't just still or stuck or stagnant. Nature has wildness to it, but after the wildness comes the contraction. After the wildness comes the peace. So understanding that the balance is not a state that we're trying to just be calm all the time, or we're supposed to have this sort of yoga class idea of we're just chill and equanimity and just we're unruffled. But actually when you do go off, that you also have the other side that comes in. I spent a long time managing my sleep, and it's like, okay, I got to there's a window between 10:15 and 10:45, and if I'm not in bed, it creates problems if I don't. But that also becomes too much control and too much balance. There are times when I want to stay up all night because I'm just on a tear with my creativity, or wow, I'm out with people, or I just feel inspired. But then I also know that, okay, the next few days, there's also space that I want to create for the balancing of going to the nurturing and the contraction and the stillness. And then it just becomes a question of the art of living. Each of us have to really figure out what kind of risks that we want to take and what kind of life we want to have, whether we want to keep hang gliding, whether we want to keep pushing ourselves, what we want to do. And I also think that I liked what you said, Paris, about the idea of the identified patient. I think we make a mistake sometimes thinking that it's just the person with the diagnosis that needs help. It's often all the people around them. And it can be the family members or the people around, the providers, the professionals who are afraid of the risks. They're the ones we have to work with their fear as well. And we've done this terrible thing where it's like we put people into a kind of a guardian status that once you're mentally ill, so-called, that the people around you are going to have to be the ones who are responsible for keeping you safe. And if they don't, there's going to be a lawsuit, or there's going to be complaints, or they're going to get into trouble, or they're going to blame. Well, actually, risk is part of life. It's part of what we are as human beings. Encountering that mystery is part of who we are as human beings. And we all, even people who are diagnosed, have to discover and learn for ourselves, how we want to live, what kind of life that we want to have. And if we want to learn and grow in certain kinds of directions, it's going to mean taking some risks, making some failures. I mean, my first school program, I was trying to get licensed in it was a relatively spiritual and alternative, but it was still a state licensing. And I flunked out of it. I crashed and burned. And at the same time, that was, the choice that I made. And that was something that I'm glad that I did. And it wasn't the end of the story. It took me many years afterwards, but eventually I did get my master's degree. My career was delayed in a huge way, but that's part of my process. That was part of my story. I didn't have it would not have been helpful if someone or something inside of me was saying you have to do it a certain way and you can't take these kinds of risks and you can't do it this way. actually a lot of the problem, I think, with families is that it's just getting to know the young person. You have 3 children. They became a doctor, a lawyer, and a successful business person. And actually your 4th kid isn't on that path. They're on their own path. Maybe it's going to take them a little bit longer. Maybe they need to just do a simple day job. Maybe they have a totally different perspective. My family is all artists. My father's a writer, my mom's an actor, and my brother's a sculptor and a musician. And I did not choose the path of being an artist. I was the black sheep and the rebel because I went into healing arts and teaching and something very different. And so I'm loving the conversation that we're having about fear and about risks and about how we approach that, because I do think it's the heart of what it is that we're doing.
Yeah, just a few thoughts came to me there. One is the idea of homeodynamic versus homeostatic. Like living systems and living beings are not homeostatic or homeodynamic, right? There's a lot of dynamism, like you say. And there's also, I think, the issue of like genuine when we talk about well-being and health, I really disagree with the psychiatric model of that sort of flat, that very narrow window of okay, acceptable emotions and experiences, and then everything else is like mentally ill. I think well-being, like genuine well-being, is being able to have a very wide window of tolerance, like a really wide window of experience that I can tap into, I can even enjoy, I can have, and yet not lose that sense of ground, so to speak, not, still maintain that connection between earth and sky, but be able to go all the way up to, 19,000 feet to the clouds and all the way down to the ground and be able to enjoy the entire range. So I think that's what we're working towards, I think, all of us. But yeah, as I think in my work as a therapist, that's what I'm supporting people to try to be able to do, to be able to have that comfort, within a very broad range of life.
Beautiful. Harris, do you want to leave us with one more story from your hang gliding adventures? That was such an incredible, evocative space you created up in the sky with the birds and the thermals and the quiet.
Do you want so it should be a peaceful story?
Or however, whatever you want to lay on us, man.
Gosh, so many. Probably my favorite place. I've flown so many places around the world, but probably my favorite place still to this day, as far as just absolute beauty, is Telluride, Colorado, the center of Colorado, where you've got like 13 and 14,000 foot peaks all around you. And I was doing tandems there for quite a while, taking people off the top, and something about just the incredible joy of just getting surrounded by these massive mountains, and there's glacial lakes, and you can just see so far, and in the US especially, we have some birds here, but boy, in the US you have so many different kinds of like eagles, and hawks, and vultures that join you, and that they show you where the lift is. So if you're looking closely, you can see the other birds circling, and you join them and circle together, and up you go. I had one particular flight where I did a bit of an Icarus. I was getting higher and higher, and I knew I shouldn't go any higher because I was actually getting hypoxic. I was getting so high. I was starting to get really giddy and dizzy. You actually get really happy at first when you start running out of oxygen. And I got all the way that's when I got to 19,500 feet. And I was like, wow, this is so fun. I'm like, wait a minute, I'm a little too happy. And the world started to tunnel vision on me. Like, oh shit. It was so beautiful and amazing. But then I was like, okay, this is an Icarus experience for sure. And so I quickly left and found some sinking air and started circling. And next thing I knew, I was on landing. It must have been half an hour later. I was down in the valley on approach to land. I couldn't remember I lost memory. I obviously didn't fully black out because I managed to fly to the landing zone. But yeah, I kind of like came to on landing approach and had a nice landing. And so it was so that was my Icarus experience. I found ground again but I got to taste both extremes in that flight, and somehow survived the whole thing.
How did you survive that? How did you actually navigate the glider while you
I
were
don't
blacked
know. I went
out?
into some kind of, it must have been some kind of just barely hanging in there with consciousness, where I was, still flying. I was kind of literally on autopilot, but I wasn't able, I guess I didn't have enough cognitive capacity to form essentially memory. I didn't have any recall of that 20 minutes or whatever it was. So yeah, that was a bit lucky. There was another story there of someone who did the same thing, and the glider ended up breaking and tumbling, and he completely passed out. And he woke up. Luckily, he woke up before he hit the ground and was able to throw his parachute. As he got lower, he was able to breathe, get more oxygen through the parachute, and was okay. But yeah, luckily that didn't happen to me then. So that was an example of like really riding the edges of my tolerance, my window of tolerance, for sure. So it's still quite an amazing experience. But yeah, that was definitely pushing the edge a bit.
Incredible. Paris, do you want to give us information about how people can contact you and remind us about your book?
Yep. Rethinkingmadness.com is a good way to, you can actually have a free PDF version on the homepage. So you can download the book for free right there. Or if you want a hard ebook or hardcover version or softcover version, there's links to that as well. And there's a really extensive resource directory on that same website, so that people might find that interesting. And my other website is pariswilliamsphd.com. So that's my kind of therapy website. So you can learn a little bit more about my work. What I was going to say on that rethinkingmadness.com, I have an articles page, and there's a couple of webinars there you can watch for free. And if you're interested more in the kind of spiritual emergency side of things, I have a little guidebook there. What do I call it? Guidebook, working through spiritual and existential crisis is what the little guidebook's called. And I go through my own madness journey in a lot more detail in that book. You kind of use it as a back and forth between my experience and supporting someone through a kind of spiritual or existential crisis. That's another resource people might enjoy.
Paris Williams, thank you so much for joining us on Madness Radio.
Yeah, thank you, Will. Thank you, Dina. Really lovely to connect to you both.
And Dina Tyler, thank you for co-hosting today on Madness Radio.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here. It was such an honor to talk with you, Paris. Thank you.
Likewise.
You've been listening to an interview with Paris Williams. Paris Williams is a PhD in clinical psychology who went through his own experience of extreme states and madness, and now works as a therapist with people diagnosed with psychosis, including from a spiritual emergence and trauma perspective. His book is called Rethinking Madness. That's all the time we have on Madness Radio. Thanks a lot for tuning in. What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health.